It's an absolute pleasure to host two of America's finest reporters here tonight, Philip Rucker and Carol Leonnig of the Washington Post. They'll be talking about their superb new book, A Very Stable Genius, Donald Trump's Testing of America. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's only been out for a few weeks, and it has already graced the #1 slot on the New York Times bestseller list. So definitely finding its audience. Since the presidential election in 2016, there's been no shortage of books about Donald Trump. That's because the 45th president has managed to insert himself daily, hourly, minute by minute, into virtually every aspect of our national life. One might say that he's infected the American psyche. There is simply no getting away from him. To understand more deeply Donald Trump's mindset and behavior and the impact of his presidency on everything from the workings of the White House to the rule of law to norms of discourse and civility to America's standing in the world, we can now turn to Phil and Carol's remarkable study of Trump, A Very Stable Genius. The title, of course, is a phrase Trump has used more than a few times to describe himself. It's a brilliant title, to be sure, but so are the pages that follow. Don't think that this book is an exercise in armchair psychology. Far from it. It's the product of detailed, exhaustive, first-class reporting based on interviews with more than 200 insiders who work for Trump or continue to work for him today or have interacted with him since he became president. With such extraordinary access to eyewitness sources, Carol and Phil are able to fully explore the vanities and pathologies of the man in charge, to offer penetrating examination of how the actions and predilections of one president are playing out and will continue to play out in the life of our nation. Many authors set out to write a first draft of history, especially journalists. With A Very Stable Genius, Phil and Carol have succeeded in doing just that. Their book is not only essential reading for Americans today, it's a work that people will read for generations. Let's just say that they were the perfect pair to take on this subject, and it's not an easy subject, as we all know. Their resumes include Pulitzer Prizes, Polk Awards, and stints as television commentators, not to mention rigorous daily beats for one of the major newspapers in the United States. As a national investigative reporter for the Post, Carol won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting about lapses in the Secret Service, and she was part of two different teams that won Pulitzers. First, for stories about secret U.S. surveillance, and later as part of the team that wrote about Russian interference in the U.S. elections. Phil, widely regarded as one of the most talented journalists writing about American politics, has covered Congress, the presidential campaigns of Mitt Romney and Donald Trump, and also the Obama administration. He was also on the Post team with Carol that won the Pulitzer for national reporting in 2018. He's now the paper's White House bureau chief. And last but not least, we are so incredibly fortunate to have with us tonight as our moderator, a good friend and veritable journalistic legend in Washington and across the nation, Andrea Mitchell. Yes, give her a hand. I was not exaggerating. Andrea's chief foreign, if I really was going to tell you all that she's done over her career, we would be here till like a week from, tomorrow. But just to sum it up, Andrea's chief foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News, host of MSNBC's daily news program, Andrea Mitchell Reports, a veteran reporter on national security, intelligence, and American politics going back several decades, winner of way too many awards for me to list here, and perhaps best of all from our vantage point at PNP, she's the author of an excellent memoir called Talking Back. So we thank her for being part of this event tonight, and please join me in welcoming Phil Rucker, Carol Leonnig, and Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
That's great.
Thank you all. Well, thank you. It is so great to be here. I could not resist this invitation. This is the definitive book. So many have been written, so much has been written about the extraordinary presidency of Donald J. Trump so far, but a very stable genius, peels back layers and layers, and is the most deeply reported book. So congratulations to my friends, Phil and Carol. And it's really a great tribute to them that you're all here tonight in this wonderful, wonderful venue. While we have been here, and as we were coming out on stage, there has been a briefing by the president, the vice president, people from the CDC and from NIH, Dr. Fauci, about the coronavirus. So I thought it would be great to start with what's happening now, how the administration is handling a real crisis, the first sort of external threat of this nature that they've had to, and what is unique about this president and the way he interacts with science, with facts, with decisions. You know, we have a lot of acting secretaries. He says, I like acting, because that way he has control over a secretary, a cabinet. They can't really hire a chief of staff up, come up with their own policies. So there are a lot of implications of the way they're responding. Just our own reporting tonight is, and I'm sure it matches a lot of yours, is that there has not been a replacement at the National Security Council for Tom Bossert, for the several other people who have left and not been replaced, the people who were supposed to track health threats, bioweapons, and things of that nature. So the staffing of the National Security Council, especially under the new head, Robert O'Brien, has been really diminished. And how are they responding to this? Phil, they've placed Vice President Pence in charge of the government-wide response.
That's correct. We were backstage actually watching the press conference live on Andrea's phone, her iPhone. So she doesn't stop following the news. Trump has named Pence to be effectively the czar for coronavirus, although he will not call it a czar. That's the kind of thing Obama had, and so we're not to have that now. But Pence, former Indiana governor, the vice president, he does not have much expertise in infectious diseases or pandemics. This is not a pandemic yet, but it could be. But he's going to be in charge and coordinating within the government. And in all seriousness, it's a huge challenge for Trump and his administration, because this is a president who, for 3 years now, has waged a war on science. He's waged a war on facts. He has tried to suppress the experts inside the government. He's tuned them out when they bring him intelligence and information. He's weakened their budgets, cut their budgets rather, tried to weaken their power internally. And now we're at a potential crisis for the country where he needs the very government experts that he's been shutting out to be doing their jobs, to be on the beat, so to speak, and to be providing truthful, credible information to the public that's hungry to have it. People want to hear from the president right now about what they can do to be safe, to protect their families, to protect their communities, and it's a credibility test for him, because he's not proven to this point to be providing factual information all the time.
You know, and Carol, the initial response when he was in India yesterday, and when Larry Kudlow, the head of the National Economic Council, came out and tried to reassure people in the White House briefing room, was to say, everything's okay, it's not going to get here. You know, there's a big ocean, I guess, between them and us. And basically say everything was all right. The markets clearly did not believe that. And so the disconnect between the reality of a virus that, while not as deadly as Ebola, for instance, which President Obama had to deal with, the mortality rate is 2.5% to 3%, according to NIH. But the fact is, it spreads very, very quickly, and it's now popped up in Sicily and the Canary Islands and Milan, and now that it's in Europe and elsewhere, there's tremendous nervousness, and it's already hurting China's GDP because of all the shut down factories, which will are already affecting our supply lines and things of that nature. So the disconnect between their rosy scenario, which is all based on let's keep those markets up, let's talk the markets up.
And it's not just, I totally agree, the president is obsessed with the markets because he views that as his path to re-election, right? The economy's good, presidents with good economies get reelected. But the president sometimes doesn't understand the consequences of his insistence on rejecting fact and science and information. He spent 3.5+ years, according to our reporting, basically telling experts in the cadre of public service. I've got this. I don't need what you have. I'm a game day player, and I ran a really successful company, and so I can run the federal government. And the problem with that is a lot of public servants have become so demoralized over time that they're now sort of like, cowering in the corners, in the bowels of their agencies, and they're not stepping up to have their head lopped off as the guy who told the president what he didn't want to hear. Remember, Joe Maguire, the director of national intelligence, who was going to leave anyway, found himself summarily dismissed a little early because he told the president what he didn't want to hear, which is that Russia is attempting to interfere in the election of 2020 to benefit you, and also to, raise up Bernie Sanders, who has less chance of beating you. This is a problem a consequence of something Phil and I learned in the course of our reporting. When you tell people you will be punished for saying what I don't want to hear, you basically get silence. And the other day it was deafening to see a head of DHS who's been acting, I think, for 9 to 12 months, basically saying he couldn't answer any of the basic questions about coronavirus, even though that agency has an entire unit devoted to fighting viruses and managing the response.
And what you brought up about the intelligence community, which I've covered for years, was so chilling last Friday when I was reporting on this and being told that the president's attack on the intelligence community, the appointment of Rick Grinnell, who had no intelligence experience, who in fact has had a public relations company which has represented Moldova and Kazakhstan and Hungary and a lot of other countries that have all sorts of issues, and that he was not only going to take over the 17 intelligence agencies, but that Kash Patel, who was kind of the hatchet man, I have to say, for Devin Nunes at House Intelligence, who was very involved in ferrying information to the president and who clearly mischaracterized this intelligence briefing on the Russian threat, was going to be placed in a very senior role there. Initially, it was supposed to be deputy, but then there was such a rebellion and resignation threats that it's now not going to be deputy. But this purging of intelligence is a profoundly disturbing continuation of what you're reporting.
That's true, but it's also not totally surprising because what we've seen is every time the president avoids consequence, avoids accountability for his actions, he becomes more emboldened, right? So after the 2-year Russia investigation concludes and special counsel Robert Mueller decides not to bring charges against the president, even though there's evidence showing his attempts to obstruct justice in the Congress, doesn't end up acting on that. The next day after Mueller's testimony, he picks up the phone and calls the Ukrainian president to ask for that favor. And then we have the impeachment inquiry, and even though the House impeached President Trump, the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, acquitted him. They didn't see his conduct as worthy of removal from office. And so what Trump learned from that was that he can do basically what he wants, and he's going to have a compliant Republican Party on Capitol Hill, and he's not going to face consequences because he's the president. That's even a legal argument that one of his lawyers presented during the impeachment trial. And so what we've seen the last few weeks since the trial ended is a president totally unchained and doing as he pleases. And what he has wanted to do from day one is clean house in the intelligence agencies and get rid of the people he calls the deep state, those he doesn't trust, those who he thinks are conspiring against him, even though he sometimes doesn't have evidence to support his theories, but to just push them out and bring in allies who he considers loyalists, who he thinks are going to fight on his behalf politically. And that's what we see now with Rick Grinnell and his new deputy.
Now, what we see throughout your narrative are examples of people trying to do a good job, the people in the government. Now, I'm not only talking about the impeachment witnesses from the State Department and the NSC, but you see cabinet officers trying to do the right thing and then making compromises to avoid an explosion. And finally, as with James Mattis, who saw himself as a guardrail, finally reaching a point where undercutting and abandoning our allies, the Syrian Kurds, was just a bridge too far. I was going to say that in reading this, it reads like a political thriller. This narrative is just extraordinary. But then you realize just how serious the consequences are, and it gets really scary. For me, and we can talk about immigration and some of those decisions, the firing on Twitter of everyone from the Secretary of State to the National Security Advisor that he claimed, and Jim Mattis when he finally read the letter and understood that Jim Mattis's resignation letter was very sharply critical. It took a while for him to get that, like 24 hours. And then to say it where someone read it to him and he said then, okay, you're done. So he didn't get the 2 months or more exit that he wanted to go to the NATO allies, to go to the annual meeting, to exit properly. It was just up and out. But all of that, the showdown with Jeff Sessions, James Comey, William Barr's manipulative pre-buttal, I should say, rather, of the Mueller report, and that you're in the room there where Barr and Mueller you create it.
Quite a tense moment.
You've got all of that tension. But there's nothing that really grabbed my attention as fiercely as Chapter 9, which is shocking the conscience, which is shocking the reader, which is the meeting in the tank. And that's the meeting, and you've got to read this. If you've read it already, read it again, because it basically it lays the groundwork, I think, for the end of Tillerson's tenure, because it led to what our report several months later, belatedly, which was that he then called, after the meeting, they were looking at each other in such shock, and he said, he's a moron. I eliminated the
Actually,
expletive.
he said he's an effing moron.
I know. See, I'm trying to be, sort of.
There are a lot of those F words in the book.
Well, we did not say effing moron on NBC Nightly News. We just said moron. And we didn't catch up to that until October, I think, is when we did that
Carol
piece.
Lee
But the very next day, and you recount in the book, I was interviewing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, and asked him about this meeting, and he misled me completely. He said, well, he asked some tough questions. But what he really said, according to your reporting, which is shocking, because it also lays the seeds eventually for the Mattis resignation as well, he showed such disrespect to the generals. At one point he said in your book, you're all losers. You don't know how to win anymore. I wouldn't go to war with you people. You're a bunch of dopes and babies. So Phil, let's talk about that. And Carol.
Phil and I have a dance, just so you know. We go back and forth, because we know the material.
Which is great.
And Carol tells this story very well. So.
And Carol, this is someone who had a bone spur, quote unquote, and did not serve in Vietnam.
And that definitely was in the minds of some of the people who talked to us afterwards. This is a gripping scene, and part of the reason it's so gripping is we thought we knew it when we were reporting it roughly in real time. But when Phil and I went back, we learned a little bit more, just like your great reporters broke the story about the effing moron, and I can say effing, even though my mom's in the audience. So in July 2017, basically what's happening is Gary Cohn, head of National Economics Advisory Council, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, they are all sort of beside themselves. They invite the president to this room of gravitas, a sacred room in the Pentagon called the Tank. And they invite him there because they know he likes the trappings of this room. He sees it as very serious. It's a room where war and peace decisions are made. And they want to stop fighting with him about all of the things that they've been fighting about with him. Where troops are forward deployed, where bases are located. The president thinks it's expensive and a waste of money. How come Korea can't pay for the bases that help protect them? He wants to make some money on these bases and these troops. The treaties and the trade agreements that he thinks are wasteful and a bad deal, and he can make a better deal. And they all want to bring him here to explain to him, these are the things that allow us to all sleep safe and dear at night. They keep America safe, and here's how. And they have charts and graphs, and they put things on the wall to make this clear to him. They're not condescending to him, but he does not like the Schoolhouse Rock vibe of this moment. And he starts bellowing and barking. It's a theme that comes up later and over again in the book. He's almost insulted that somebody with expertise wants to tell him how things are. That leads to the points that you raise, Andrea. You're dopes and babies. This Afghanistan war is a loser war. You're losers. And the epithet that is the worst, to them. They all promised, not all, many of them promised they would never repeat it again. I wouldn't go to war with you people. It leads to a woman in the room starting to cry, and other people see her kind of shielding her face to avoid the embarrassment of this moment. People are so infuriated that they're trying to figure out, how can I physically leave this room? Is that possible to do? Many people are angry because Vice President Pence, whose son fought in Afghanistan, says nothing. He's described as a wax museum figure in this episode, and they're wondering, why doesn't he even stand up to defend his son? Secretary Mattis has his head bowed, and as Phil actually, these are his beautiful words, genetically a Marine, unable to really speak back to the commander-in-chief. Finally, Rex Tillerson, according to aides, is so upset that he stands up and says, "You're wrong, Mr. President. Most of everything you've said is wrong. And troops do not go out to the Korean Peninsula to make a buck. They fight for our freedom. They give their lives. They offer their lives. This is not about money." That is the beginning of the end of their relationship.
And for Jim Mattis, who went through so many iterations of trying to hold it together, I know this from my reporting, I know it from your book, and finally, that moment with the Syrian Kurds was just too much to take.
Yeah, this is, Mattis spent 2 years as the defense secretary trying to, and he saw it this way, to protect the world order, to protect America as we came to know it, to protect NATO, to protect our alliances, to make sure that the president understood which countries are actually our enemies, which dictators we're actually not supposed to be friends with. And at near the 2-year mark, the president decided, kind of on a whim, in the course of a couple of days, to pull the troops out of Syria and abandon the Kurds. And Mattis saw that as an abandonment of our allies that was flat wrong. And he thought, people would lose their lives over this. And he didn't want to stand by it. And he decided in that moment to resign. And we have this sort of TikTok of his resignation in the book. And ultimately, Trump trying to get the better of Mattis by then saying, "You're not going to have your 2 months to serve out your job. I want you gone by New Year's and out the door." And to underscore how difficult that moment was at the Pentagon, there was discussion among Mattis's senior aides that they would do a clap out, which is when he would leave the Pentagon for his final day on the job, and everybody who works in the department would line the hallways in the parking lot and just applaud him as he walked out. And Mattis said, "No, you can't do a clap out. The president's going to retaliate against the people left here at the Pentagon if you do that." And so there was no clap out for him.
There was no final, parade.
There was no final anything. And we've seen that actually in the book again and again and again. When people who served at the highest levels leave this government, there's very little ceremony. It's disgraceful in a way, the way they're treated. Rex Tillerson, for example, got fired while he was on a diplomatic mission to Africa. The reason he took that trip to Africa was because the president had insulted African leaders by calling their countries S-hole countries. And so Tillerson went to try to clean up that mess in Africa, and while he's in Africa, got the notice. It was actually in a tweet from the president that he was being fired. The president then calls Tillerson a couple days later on the phone and says, we're good. Come on by the Oval Office. Let's take pictures for you going away. He never made that trip, and he left pretty unceremoniously.
And there's an episode you describe with Kirsten Nelson when I think of secretaries who, executed some really terrible policies, separation of children. But she was trying to navigate some kind of balance, I think, and in the way you've described it in the book, that call to her, in the middle of the night, she's in Europe on a mission that was well, planned to meet with some of her foreign counterparts, intelligence people on Homeland Security issues. And the president calls, and you pick up the story, Carol. They don't wake her, so the president's really
She's
angry.
already, this is another example of, we thought we knew, it was all clear. Kirsten Nielsen, evil person who caged children. It's a lot more complicated than that. And that time she's in London, for a series of meetings, some of which involve then flying to the G20, which is pretty serious, and we usually try to send people there. But she gets a call because the president wants her back. A series of aides are like, "Why are you in London? Don't you know what's going on?" Well, what's going on back in the White House is reports are coming in that and they're not media reports, they're government reports that show that the number of immigrants who've crossed the border illegally has not skyrocketed, it's the highest ever for that year and in several years. And the president is furious. And one aide actually says to her, "I don't know why you thought you could leave. This is a big deal." And she says, "I do more things than the border. You know, I'm the Secretary of Homeland Security," which, by the way, was created to prevent another 9/11, not to keep illegal immigrants out. But he says to her, "Well, you know what? The border is all we do here in the White House." So she gets back, and it eventually leads to her some summary firing. She realizes over the course of several days that her relationship with the president is tanking. She flies out to California for an event on the border with him where he's going to show that they're getting tough. And she starts to recognize that her deputy is spending a little bit of time with White House officials, and it becomes clear to her that her deputy is now going to replace her. She goes to the White House to try to explain to him that all of the things that they can do to fix this problem that she's worried about, that he is worried about, and he's having none of it. He says, "You know, you have this deal to cut 50% of immigrants moving from the Triangle up through Mexico. That's the problem with you. Why can't it be 100%? And she says, "Mr. President, we can't cut it by 100%. We have allies that are offering to help us cut it." And he says, "Yeah, that's the problem with you." And she realizes it's over then. The sad thing about her, I don't know how to say it, her abusive ending is everybody gets a security detail, especially cabinet members, based on the threat assessment for them. And her office and her staff are notified that they're going to rip all of the security equipment out of her condominium townhouse in Virginia the day that she's supposed to leave. And a series of foreign officials, the identity of which we're not allowed to provide, offer to provide her with security because the president won't do it. And she realizes that's going to look pretty bad. So she goes to the president personally and says, "You know, this is pretty awful. I wonder if you'd just give me a little bit of grace, a few weeks, for me to install my own cameras." She's getting death threats, right? The woman who caged children.
Well, there were protesters who went into a restaurant when she was eating dinner.
Yes. And I won't keep talking, but the caging children thing is really something she inherited through a series of nightmarish events, which we can talk about later.
Vladimir Putin. So the president is really eager, almost obsessed, as you write in the book, to meet Putin for the first time. And I guess he'd wanted to meet him with the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow, and that hadn't worked out. And he really wants to meet Putin. Tillerson goes on a trip, as you describe it, to prepare for this meeting at the G20 in Hamburg. It's going to be some sort of a pull-aside as well. And Tillerson comes back and tries to prepare him. They have the meeting with Putin. And then the president is basically rejecting Tillerson's advice that Putin would try to take advantage of the United States. He refuses to accept that possibility. And it's sort of a fascinating matchup because Tillerson has been hired because he knew Putin as the head of ExxonMobil. And now he won't listen to him.
Yeah, it's incredible. You know, Tillerson may not have been an expert in the State Department bureaucracy and Foggy Bottom. He got a bad rap there. But one thing he knows is Putin and Russia. As the CEO of ExxonMobil for many years, he negotiated directly with Putin and with Russia and had met him many, many times over the years. So he came in as a Russia expert, and he tried to teach the president, Putin is not your friend. He is a trained KGB operative, former agent. He has a strategic goal on behalf of Russia of destabilizing the world order and of taking advantage of the United States. And he's not here to help you. And Trump wouldn't really hear it. Trump had a fascination with Putin that predates his presidency, of course. And during the transition, when he was interviewing candidates for Secretary of State, he actually interrupted one of the job interviews at Trump Tower in his office and said to Reince Priebus, who was set to become the White House chief of staff, said, "Reince, when can I go meet Putin? Can we do it before the inauguration?" And Reince had to tell him, "No, sir, there's only one president at the time, and right now it's Barack Obama, and it's not appropriate for you to have a meeting like that before you take office. And by the way, if you were to have a meeting like that, it should be with our democratic Western allies." Anyhow, after Trump had that 2-hour pull-aside in Hamburg, Germany, at the sidelines of a summit, he felt like he knew Putin inside out. He got it handled. He just tuned out all of Tillerson's advice on Putin, and I think directly told Tillerson, "Don't worry about it. I know more about him than you do because I've had that meeting."
And then we saw what happened in Helsinki afterwards. I mean,
Yeah, I was there in Helsinki, and it was a really, it was a jarring moment. I mean, we all saw it play out on television too, but incredible.
And these are lasting mistakes that are unique to this president. So how do we forecast the rest of the first term and whatever may happen if he's reelected? In that, I mean, you described that William Barr, Robert Mueller meeting, which sets up the way the Mueller report was in fact not, executive summaries were not put out, which the Mueller people had expected. Mueller's people made a number of mistakes. They trusted Barr. Is that?
You know, we like to say that Robert Mueller was operating in the old Justice Department of the 1950s. He was the Boy Scout, the priest. He was like, "Look, I wrote a memo. I've got all my evidence. Here you go." And Bill Barr was operating in the era of Trump, where, you know, grabbing the megaphone or the microphone or the Twitter handle is the most valuable tool. Mueller was actually a little bit upset, but most of his staff was furious when Barr issued these summaries that didn't use the actual language that Mueller's people had put together, which was that there is substantial evidence that the president engaged in obstructing a criminal probe, and that if he weren't the sitting president, he could potentially be in jail. And that is not what Barr said in his summary. What he said was the president is exonerated of anything involving collusion. Correct. There is not there's insufficient evidence. That was Barr's wording, not Mueller's. And when Mueller contacts Bill Barr in his office to say, "Look, you got to put out the summaries," Barr says, "I'll think about it. It's good to talk to you. I'll think about that." And at the end of the thinking, they shake hands and say, we're with the Justice Department together. That's the most important thing. But the most important thing was stealing that microphone, and Barr effectively did it. And for at least a month, the regular public had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes.
And that was a critical period where the Trump White House created the narrative on Twitter and in interviews and described the Mueller report before anyone could get the Mueller report. And by the time it was released, it really had been defined and it had been branded, if you will.
I mean, how many times did we all hear the phrase from the president, "total and complete exoneration," which of course is not what the Mueller report found. And to add to Carol's point about Mueller, there's a moment, I think, in the book, a scene we have that's pretty telling. It's the first time Bill Barr, newly confirmed as the Attorney General, meets face-to-face with Robert Mueller, and they're in a conference room at the Justice Department, and all their deputies are there, Rod Rosenstein, everyone involved in really running this investigation. And it was a relatively cordial, professional meeting. They were getting to know each other. This was when Mueller and his team were giving an update to Barr and his team about how the investigation would be concluding. But Mueller begins the meeting by holding up a piece of paper where he had scripted some notes, and his hands are shaking. And after he read from that paper, he puts it down, and then Aaron Zebley, his, I think, chief of staff on the special counsel team, largely took over the meeting and provided most of the substance. And Barr afterwards and his deputies at the Justice Department said to each other, "That is not the Bob Mueller we know." The Bob Mueller they know was the decorated, revered FBI director for 12 years, not the man having difficulty in that meeting. And of course, we all saw that Bob Mueller when he testified before Congress, but it was upsetting to people in that room to see the special counsel not be as forceful and strong as they wish he had been.
One thing that was striking was the president's desire to get rid of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And here he was, an international...
He really is upset about corruption,
business.
Andrea.
Yeah. I know, I forgot that. But
the Ukraine thing is all about corruption.
of course it was, the July 25th call. So that is something for him to explicitly, if one of you wants to describe how he's eager to, I mean, this is the sort of the foundational law that stops our companies from bribing overseas. And in all of my travels, when you talk to American companies or global companies, they are at a disadvantage, very frankly, because other countries have no such law, and that's the fact of life, and that's why we're different from other countries. But
right, this is a moment early in the administration, March 2017. There's an odd jumble of different kinds of aides who represent different agencies in the Oval Office with the president. And they're discussing some business people who are going to be prosecuted for bribing another official to get business in that foreign country. And the president's ear perked up at the words bribery, and he wants to know, he turns to, no joking around, he turns to Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, who happens to be there for a different reason, and says, you know what, Rex, I need you to get rid of that law. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a big problem. It's not fair that our businesses aren't allowed to bribe foreign officials. It's a problem. Rex Tillerson is a little bit, according to the people that we spoke to about this meeting and were briefed, he's a little bit flummoxed for two reasons. One, Secretary of State really doesn't weigh in on overturning laws involving a Justice Department prosecuted item. And number two, Rex Tillerson believes in the fact that we're the city on the hill, that the standard is not for America to be the police officer in countries, but that we want to set the highest standard on human rights, on torture, and on corruption. So he basically comes up with one line, which is, I don't think I'm your guy. The president turns to Stephen Miller, who is his guy. That's a crowd pleaser. He turns to Stephen Miller and says, Stephen, we got to do something. So if Rex can't do it, how about an executive order? Eventually, even Miller acknowledges, not to the president, but to others, an executive order is also not going to get rid of the anti-corruption law. Maybe that could have been another tank meeting, a Schoolhouse Rock on how you get rid of laws. That's the end of that.
now, there's a number of episodes where Chris Christie is pressured by the president to replace John Kelly as chief of staff. How is that going to go?
This is one of my favorites.
I mean, can you imagine if that had worked?
And we'll just preface that by saying the president, throughout this time in office, has been fixated on finding the leakers inside the White House. So what happens is it's the end of 2018. John Kelly is being pushed out as the chief of staff. Trump is looking for a new chief of staff. He reaches out to Chris Christie, says, Chris, come on down. I need to see you right away in the White House. Christie then gets a call from Rudy Giuliani, who says he's going to name you chief of staff. Get ready. The first call Christie makes is to Jim Baker, the former chief of staff to President Bush. And Baker says, if you're calling, you're about to be offered the worst fucking job in America. And anyhow, they have a conversation as Christie's on the Amtrak down from New Jersey about all the things that he needs to go over with the president and the rules he needs to set. He goes into the residence. He sneaks in the back way so nobody sees him. And it's just Christie, Trump, and Melania Trump. And they have a conversation about chief of staff. And Trump says, I want you to be my chief of staff. I'm going into a re-election cycle. You're political. You've got my back. I want you there. Christie said, remind me how this is going to work with Jared Kushner. Is Jared still going to be in the White House? Because remember, Christie put Jared's father in jail as the U.S. attorney in New Jersey. There's a lot of bad blood there. Christie thinks about it. He gets back on the train later that night to go back to New Jersey. He's still pondering. the offer and deciding what to do. And he's at the stop in Wilmington. He's only been on a train for about 90 minutes, and the phone buzzes. A news alert has come out from Axios saying Trump has offered Chris Christie the job of chief of staff. And Christie's thinking, how on earth did this get out? There were only 3 people in the room. And it turns out when he called Trump the next day to decline the offer, Trump says to Christie, that was a great story, wasn't it? And Christie says, yeah, sir, I was wondering, how'd that get out? How did Jonathan Swan find out about this? And Trump says, oh, I called him. He's a good guy. I told him. So Christie is sitting there thinking to himself, thank God I did not accept this offer to be chief of staff, because the president is leaking on himself.
And that's how we got Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff.
And that's right. At the same time, Mick Mulvaney had been the OMB director, budget director, very much wanted to be chief of staff, had been kind of jockeying for the job, and Trump ended up picking him. And he's been the acting chief of staff now for 14 months.
Because being in charge of the entire federal budget is not enough work.
He's had both jobs, technically.
Right.
Yeah.
Like having the head of national intelligence who's also the ambassador to Germany.
And a Twitter defender.
At the same time. There are some questions that have been passed up from the audience. I just wanted to broaden our conversation to include more of you. One questioner is, much of what you wrote has been and will be denied by the administration. Do you trust your sources beyond question? Carol.
The lucky thing about the answer to this question is that, everything Phil and I did for this book is basically following the same game plan for the reporting we do at the Washington Post times 10. We are very, very careful with the anonymous sources because people have agendas, people have motivations, some of which they're very good at concealing, and some of which they're pretty open about, which is nice. But we didn't. For example, the tank scene. The president hasn't disputed what he said, and the reason is because multiple people were there. We vetted this to determine, did people have consistent recollections? Did they have notes, which we checked? Did they have calendar entries? Did they remember where people were seated? Were they really there? And then we looked at pictures. So it was that kind of vetting, just for that moment, that helps you understand a little bit of what went into checking this. We didn't take one person's word for how something went down. We had to go to multiple people, because this is really it's a time when we're being accused of being fake news, and we certainly take it very seriously, always, about the accuracy of our reporting. But right now, it's almost like you're letting down the entire industry if you publish something that's even close to questionable. And Phil and I carry that like a badge, like we are not going to let anybody down, and we're going to be really, really incredibly rigorous in how we do our work.
And you really are the gold standard.
And I just want to point out one thing in addition to what Carol said to stress. The book has been out now for 5 weeks, and there's not a single piece of reporting in it that the president or his spokespeople or aides at the White House have contested. He has called us stone cold losers. He's called the book a work of fiction. We hope it's on the nonfiction shelf at Politics and Prose. But he has not contested anything in it, and it's because he knows it's true.
And as I was saying, you are the gold standard. I mean, you and your colleagues at the Washington Post and our friends at the New York Times and other...
And you, Andrea.
Well, it's really, thank you, but there's a question here which relates to that, the pressure of reporting on this White House, this administration. I've covered 7 administrations. There's nothing like this because of social media, the president using social media, people being fired on social media. Rex Tillerson was fired at 8:40 on a Monday morning. I was not in the newsroom at the time, and I'm supposed to know when the Secretary of State is being fired.
Do you know, I remember that day really well. I happened to be in the studio because I'm a contributor to MSNBC, and I was there early morning to talk about something completely different. And I'll tell you what, Andrea Mitchell, she is hot on a story because she came in coat flapping. I said, hi, Andrea. She's like, gotta go. She was on that story. She's like, okay, what about Rex?
It was something else that morning. I mean, that's the kind of, so the tension and the pressure. So one of our wonderful members of our audience asks, how could you possibly decide when to cut off material gathering for this book? So much happens every day.
It's a great question. We, when we agreed to write this book, we didn't necessarily have an end in mind. And we had a series of conversations with our editor, Ann Godoff, who, by the way, is like a queen.
She's a
amazing.
legend in publishing.
If you ever write a book, do it with Ann Godoff. So we had these conversations with her, and she kept saying, you know, Carol and Phil, you've got to think about when you're going to put the pen down. When are you going to put the pen down? And we couldn't figure out the right arc. We contemplated waiting till the end of the first term, which would be another year from now. And we just decided, you know what? We kept gathering so much important, interesting information. We felt an obligation to get it out into the public. Not that anything was like urgent. We would have brought that to the newspaper first, but you know, interesting detail that we wanted to share. And we found a really natural endpoint with the conclusion of the Mueller investigation. And we decided there's a narrative arc there. Through the entire first 2.5 years of the presidency, he was fixated on Russia. He saw Mueller as a cloud. It shaped the way he viewed the entire intelligence and national security apparatus of the country. And then from that point forward, he set out on the re-election campaign trail to try to win over the voters again. And impeachment began with the call to Ukraine. And so that became a really natural ending for the narrative. But you're right, there's no easy way to put it down. And in the 2 months when we finished the book and now, we could have written a whole other book. I mean, there's literally so much that has happened, and
We hope you do.
you can never find the right time to end.
Another question, Carol, is what were some of the reporting challenges that you faced? Did people hang up on you? That happens every day. Did you meet people in unusual places? Was there a garage somewhere under the Watergate? And did you think you were being followed?
Well, interestingly, the threads of that question all work together very well in a story that I'm thinking about and that Phil and I discussed before. There were a lot of sources who were really quite afraid of meeting with us. Part of the reason is, dang it, we're on TV, so we're recognizable sometimes, and we become like a skunk. Nobody wants to be seen with us. So there was one source who was really important for fly on the wall for some key moments when the president was doing things that we'd never heard about before. And that person really did not want to meet anywhere near Washington, D.C. And so asked if we would meet in a place sort of far, far flung, ex-urban Virginia, which is fine. I've met some Secret Service agents out there too. I know how to drive out there. We communicated through encrypted communications out of fear that the government might be looking behind me or their communications. But at the last minute, the person changed the location. I felt like I was Carrie Matheson, and basically just said, I feel like we're being watched, so not at this restaurant, and we moved to a new one. There was a lot of fear and panic, and there's a reason for people to be afraid in this moment. And the reason is the president is, while a genius at marketing himself, he's also become a genius at bullying people into silence and fear. Because when he comes after, Shifty Schiff, people can have their disagreements politically about whether or not the House Intelligence Committee was doing the right thing or not. This crowd may feel very strongly one way or another. Other people may feel very differently. But to go ad hominem at people is weird. But this president goes ad hominem at little people, right? So there is great anxiety. He went after Alexander Vindman, Lieutenant Colonel, whose sin was essentially complying with a legal House subpoena, testifying about what he does in his job as a career military officer working on the National Security Council. So there's a reason why sources are afraid, and they know that this is a very big megaphone that can be turned at them.
Another question is, in the news media that I follow, there's a lot of emphasis on fact-checking, but the thousands of lies this administration and this president have told, which certainly the Washington Post has been cataloging, has not moved the needle with Trump's base. What will it take? There's a number of assumptions built into that question that as you and Carol and your colleagues communicate things to the public, that it will penetrate?
It's not believed.
Is it that people are just following the news media that they trust and that reinforce their own beliefs, and that the people who would otherwise get this information are not following or reading what you're writing?
Yeah, one of the amazing things that Donald Trump has done as a politician, as a political leader in this country, is convince tens of millions of Americans that his word is the truth and the only truth. And he's convinced them that the news media is not to be believed, that what we write in the Washington Post not to be believed, that what you watch on NBC Nightly News, even though it's thoroughly reported and vetted and fact-checked and lawyered, is not to be believed. And as a journalist doing this work, it's really disturbing. I went to Orlando for his re-election campaign kickoff, which was very soon after the conclusion of the Russia investigation, and one of the first rallies where Trump was going to be talking about the findings of the Mueller report. And it was a huge arena, downtown Orlando, 20,000 people there. And I interviewed a bunch of them, and to a person, they all said, oh, he's totally exonerated. The entire thing was a hoax. Russia didn't interfere. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, they're just parroting the president's talking points. And I don't think there's anything that's going to change that, because they've bought in to him and what he's promising, and they see him as their champion. They see him as their voice. They think they've been ignored by the governing class in Washington for decades, and suddenly here's a guy who's got their back and is fighting for them in the so-called swamp, and that's what they're going to believe. And we're going to continue to do our jobs and try to find this information out and bring the truth to light. But unfortunately, there's a large part of this country that doesn't want to hear it or believe it.
When you look at the world that we now face and his relationships with other countries, you recount one of your on-the-record sources is the former French ambassador to the U.S., Gerard Darreau, and he recalled that Trump's advisors would give foreign leaders a kind of cheat sheet, I know this from other ambassadors in my own reporting, on how to deal with him at summits. And, quote, this is on the record from a French diplomat, it was all advice on how to handle a difficult teenager, a very sensitive, touchy teenager. You have 6 adults trying not to excite him, and they are facing somebody who has no restraint and no limits. And we've seen this at NATO meetings and at G20s and at G7s.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really glad that was on the record, thanks to Phil's interview. I also find it really interesting that that's probably something that many world leaders have figured out how to mine. You know, we've seen people try to flatter him in the government and now outside the government. The way to his heart is to remind him of his name over and over again, to remind him of how great his crowds were at the inauguration, it's not a laughing matter, because I don't mean to scold you. I just mean that it's very serious the way he views everything. It revolves around him. He is the sun. And it's worrisome to me, because I think about Tillerson's advice to him about Putin, which he rejected. Putin has figured out, as a KGB officer, how to basically work this president. Mm-hmm. And many others have as well. What's the result of that? If you're not relying on your advisors and you're relying on the sort of sycophantic or manipulative ways of other leaders, where does that leave us in terms of decisions that are made? It leaves us with Erdogan, who the president has been buttered up by in Turkey, deciding to leave Syria because that's what Erdogan asked him. That phone call led to the Secretary of Defense leaving, and it was chilling to me when we talked to some of the people in the room when they found out that Secretary Mattis was leaving. They said that in the room, it was all of his senior team, they were in a room learning from him, I've just resigned, and all of their eyes popped out, and one person said it looked like everyone was like preparing for the end of the world. And the person who looked the most nervous was Deputy Secretary Shanahan. How can I be left here holding the bag? That's sort of the consequence of these maneuverings to try to butter up the president.
How does Mike Pompeo survive, Phil? He's the only original National Security Council member.
That's right. And he actually, and this is great reporting by Susan Glasser initially at the New Yorker, Pompeo was not for Trump initially. He was a surrogate and supporter of Marco Rubio's during the primary, and stood up in Kansas at the caucuses there and warned the people of Kansas, the voters of Kansas, that Trump would be an authoritarian president and would disregard the Constitution. I'm paraphrasing here, but that was effectively what he said. But he got on board the Trump train real fast and wanted to become the CIA director. There's a moment in the book during a transition when Pompeo is coming to Trump Tower for his job interview to be CIA director, and he's getting advice from Steve Bannon, then the political strategist, and Bannon says, I'll go in there and I'll just tell him, first in your class, West Point, you went to Harvard Law, we'll butter you up, and then you just start talking and don't even ask questions, just talk. The Trump doesn't know anything about intelligence, so he'll just be impressed if you talk to him and sound smart. And sure enough, he did. And 20 minutes into the interview, he got a handshake and the job, and he became the CIA director. He learned in that job in those first few days, as you know, Andrea, how to talk to the president and how to not manipulate him, but how to get through to him. He changed the way that the intel people gave the briefings. He would come over personally from Langley in the mornings to deliver the briefings himself because he didn't think the intel briefers would be able to communicate effectively to the president. And he ingratiated himself with the president to where when Trump was getting rid of Tillerson, he wanted Pompeo there as the Secretary of State. He's now one of the most powerful secretaries of state we've had in some time because of the way he's controlled that relationship he has with the president. And he's also become an enabler. He's a yes man as Secretary of State. He's the Secretary of State who allowed for Rudy Giuliani to be the shadow Secretary of State with Ukraine. That's not something Tillerson probably would have permitted at Foggy Bottom, but Pompeo did because he knows how to survive in this world, unlike a lot of other people.
And he allowed Marie Yovanovitch to be recalled and
exactly.
pushed out without protest. The deputy, John Sullivan, said to Yovanovitch when she was being told she had to come back and leave, and she came back hastily, as you know, under some threat of danger. And Sullivan said to her, you did nothing wrong. I don't know why this is happening.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk forever, but I have to say, one last question always. From what you've reported, how do you see the changes that they have made, that he has made, in the budget process, in scientific panels in different agencies? Are these permanent changes? Are these changes that will go back to some other norm in a year if he's not reelected, or 5-6 years from now if he is reelected? Is this a permanent change in the way our government works?
There is a lot of fear, Andrea, among the cadre of people who you'd call sort of the principal deputies or the deputy to the associate administrator, the cabinet leader. There's a lot of fear that the institutions that the president has heckled and weakened are buckling. They're still incredibly strong, but there is anxiety about what the result is. One person who we interviewed said, my biggest fear is that he's lowered the bar about what we expect of our government, and that bar, we'll never get above it again. We'll never get back there. I mean, just think about the things that have happened in the last few days. You never expected that a ODNI director would be buttonholed and tossed out for providing factual information, which is what CIA Director Brennan warned us all about more than a year and a half ago. You never expected that 4 prosecutors, you can't imagine a noisier thing, by the way, in the Department of Justice, 4 prosecutors would withdraw from a case because of the fear that they were being pressured to handle the sentencing of the president's friend differently than they should have, differently than the law called for. I have actually some quibbles with that sentencing recommendation. I did think it was too much, but that fear of the integrity being questioned. We'll see what happens. Phil and I are journalists who give the facts rather than speculate for the future. But if past is prologue from our book, I think we're going to see a more and more unburdened and unbound president who decides all of this snow globe of Washington, I can shake this to the point of breaking it, because he has a right to feel confident and invincible after the things he's hurdled that would have eliminated past presidents.
Well, I just want to say that this is a brave book, and it is, no, I mean, it is also an extraordinary, beautifully written narrative, but it's an extraordinary piece of reporting. I can't tell you if any one of these insights and scoops were in any one of our stories, you'd be proud for months and months that you would accomplish it, but it's all here in one bound, beautiful book. So I just...
That's a very high compliment from you.
No, I'm telling you, I am so amazed at what you accomplished. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to Carol Leonnig again.
Thank you all.
Really signing it.
I can take it.